In the last video of approaching full body or full figure animation, I talked about different approaches for shorthands and rough passes one can utilize to animate their characters. Now that we have our little rough animation, it's time to put that rough animation and model to a character design. In this video, I'll be talking about turning a crude shorthand or crude rough animation pass like this into a finished character with solid drawing. Hey guys, it's Toniko Pantoja, and today I'd like to talk about solidifying your rough animation into fully finished solid drawings. In 2D animation or hand-drawn animation, this is what we call the tie-down process. It's when we try to solidify and add more detail on top of your first pass or your rough drawings. Just to be clear here, the tie-down process is not considered the cleanup or the inking stage of animation. The tie-down is what comes right before the cleanup stage. That's not to say the tie-down can't be used for final lines, and productions who have to work with restrictions may have to resort to using the tie-down as their final ink and paint. But again, it really depends on the production and the restrictions that they have to work with. The tie-down stage of animation is still part of the rough animation stage, and it's usually during the later phases of a scene. Sometimes it may take multiple phases or passes of a tie-down just to get a character on model. So how can one get started on the tie-down stage of animation? And how do we turn our full body animation into a solid drawing? Before you even solidify your drawings, I would recommend a few things. One is to have a character design you'll be working with. We can't put anything on model with a body if we don't know what we're putting it into, right? The second step is to take your character design and break it into basic shapes and primitives, since animation is all about finding simpler approaches to recreating and redrawing a character over and over again. This means utilizing things such as cubes, spheres, cylinders. No matter how detailed the character is, try breaking down that character into basic primitives such as cubes and spheres. For example, you could use a giant block to resemble both the torso and the pelvis, and cylinders to represent the limbs such as legs and arms. Another thing that you can do is to basically manipulate these into shapes that resemble more of human body parts. Other things that I would suggest you do is to simplify graphic shapes for factors of your characters that might be significant, like the hair or a cape if they have it, or any costume details that they might have. That might be important for the tie-down stage. Again, try to think of simpler shapes and lines for this part. Think of these as landmarks for the design. The way I usually approach my tie-down pass is that I start finding the major keys throughout my animation. Since I did the rough animation straight ahead, I had to start figuring out what my important keys are. I usually start with my first drawing and my last drawing. That way I have a placeholder in how things begin and how things end, and I can use them as consistency placeholders and reference. Then I would work my way with the other major keys. So if a character lands a strike, if a character plants their feet, or it could just be midpoints between the beginning drawing and the last drawing of my animation. Sometimes I like to see if the character is in an up pose or down pose. That can be my extremes when I tie down. It could be a contact pose when the character has their feet planted, or it could be a story thing. It's really up to you. Then I would work my way towards the breakdowns and then eventually the in-betweens. So if I were to summarize it, I like to start big and broad and then make my way down to the specifics. So with that out of the way, let's talk about all these other options. There are many ways you can approach solid drawing for your rough animation, but the first one I'd like to talk about is a method I started with when I really wanted to invest in the tie-down and I really wanted to improve on it because that was part of my weakness. So this is an approach that really forces you to use basic primitives such as cubes, spheres, and cylinders. So here's a real story of mine. When I finished Crayon Dragon, I applied for a few internships, with one being Disney for their 2D animation spot. I didn't make the cut, but one of the common feedbacks I got besides acting was to work more on my solid drawing skills. Actually, my main weakness is usually solid drawing. During my third year, I was mentored by veteran Disney animator James Lopez, who told me to do a pass just focusing on solid drawings and solid forms alone, and not worrying about how the drawing looks, how finished it looks, or how clean it looks. Just keep it to basic primitives. Literally draw cubes, cylinders, and spheres to construct the character. I don't really try to connect the joints, since being able to draw these different forms in various angles was really the main priority for me. Use boxes for things like the torso, feet, and hands, whereas cylinders were used for limbs, arms, and legs. If there are fingers, I draw each phalange as its own cylinder. I even draw through my shape and around it to feel the form. So sometimes you'll actually see me draw an object behind another object, just so that I know it's there, and I'm not really trying to cheat anything. A practice and method like this will just force you to see the figure in solid primitives. This is something I'd recommend heavily to people who want to get better at solid drawing for animation. For overlapping animations such as hair and cloth, I usually indicate them as basic lines and shape, and sometimes I'll do them straight ahead on top of my animation. When I fill in keys, I would indicate where I feel and think they might be, but once I have more keys, more information on the animation, I'll readjust them and make changes so the overlap animation makes sense. I noticed that younger animators tend to do these mindless and mundane exercises of just rotating a solid cube or rotating form in different angles just for the sake of practice and mileage and just getting that mileage of drawing solid objects and being able to animate them. I honestly think a better way to get better at solid drawing is to use those basic solids into actual animation where you are forced to use them creatively. How do I implement this box or cube shape within a character while working with other solid shapes that make up the character? If you want to get better at solid form and full figure animation at the same time, why not do something like this instead of just drawing mundane exercises of boxes rotating in space? If you just want to animate rotating cubes and the future work that you'll do mostly consists of that, by all means do that. But if you want to do full figure animation and get better at solid drawing, again, there are better ways. Do something that challenges your problem-solving skills and your creativity. So here's something that you'll notice. I do this step slow so I can really figure out how depth and solid form works with this character. By drawing through and forcing to use solid primitives forces you to find solutions to make these solid primitives work in actual space and dimension. This is a slow and meticulous process. But because it forces a slow process, it makes you think more about making those solid primitives work. So after doing a pass with these super basic primitives, I do another tie down pass on top of this. And again, it's not cleanup, it's another tie down pass. I'll do another tie down pass where I actually put the actual character design, hair, cloth, accessories into these basic primitives. All of this is not cleanup, but just to practice my line strokes and bold decisions with my line work, I tend to be a bit more cleaner. Sometimes if you want to get a super accurate and super solid drawing, you're going to have to do multi-passes of tie-down depending on how good your draftsmanship skills are. It's a common belief that once you just do your shorthand pass or your rough animation pass, you just jump straight into cleanup. But there are some people who will probably need more passes on top of the tie-down. While you can start making cleanup lines for the character ready for ink and paint, someone like me would probably not feel confident. If this is the first time I'm animated a character, I would want to try and take my time to understand that design. For my next tie-down pass, I try to keep it as clear as possible while keeping it solid. I try not to be overly sketchy, like I said, with the lines and make my strokes more economic. I do it in the same order as I do my previous tie-down, which I start with my last drawing, my first drawing, and then go towards my major keys, my major extremes, then towards the breakdowns, and then in-betweens. I still indicate where the cloth and hair should be or where I feel it might be, but once I have more information on the actual animation and motion, I will go back, erase, and make adjustments so the overlapping action makes sense. Again, this pass is not a cleanup but a more refined tie-down pass, and it's something that I would submit for a cleanup team because it's clear enough for them to work with for the ink and paint stage. So for beginners or for people who really want to improve their draftsmanship, I would do more than just a single tie-down pass, and do another one so that you force yourself to draw more solid and clearly. Some people may be asking, but this is such a long process, how do I get good and fast at this? Well, the secret at doing something fast and good at the same time is to actually understand what you're doing. And to be able to understand what you're doing, you have to take things slow in first to be able to ingest it. And the more you force yourself to practice these slow and stalling practices, you start to build momentum and a familiarity with the practice that it eventually becomes second nature and muscle memory to you. And then you'll begin to realize, oh, I don't need to draw through that object. I don't need to draw around it. I know it. I know the form mentally already. And then you eventually start to skip steps out because you have a better understanding of how that part works. Look, the ones who stuck to basic primitives for constructing their characters may already see the form even before they draw it down, and they already visualize it in their heads. They probably won't need to do a lot of draw-throughs, and may do less steps, like I said, due to their confidence. I usually fall back into slower methods like this option when I don't feel confident about the character design, or when I'm really trying to feel out the form of this character design. So here's what the finished tie down looks. This is the second tie down pass on top of the first tie down. Again, option A is something that I would highly recommend to beginning animators tying down their animation. Option B, let's talk about the basic shape approach. Next, I want to talk about a tie down method I call basic shapes. This is something I transitioned into after doing option A for such a long time, where I started to gain an understanding of solid form and construction. Now, instead of overly describing primitives such as cubes and spheres, trying to fill in every side in detail, and instead of just using cylinders, boxes, and spheres, I can already visualize them even before putting it down. And instead, I'll resort to shapes like flour sacks, since they're more bendable, they're more expressive, and weighty. In my head, I'm visualizing these are just boxes and cubes stacked on top of each other, but more unified into a single shape. So for example, normally I'd have the arm as two separate cylinders, one being the upper and the other being the lower arm. In this pass, I'm basically making it one giant bendy shape, like a bendy cylinder that represents the whole arm. And I do the same thing for legs too. I try and keep things a bit more unified. And that way, instead of these parts feeling a little bit disconnected and disjointed, I'm making them more unified. When it comes down to putting shapes, I try to be careful with how I utilize my lines. So let's take a cylinder, for example, and let's turn it into something graphic. So let's say two parallel lines. I usually try to avoid concave lines because that usually breaks the illusion of form. Convex lines are okay because it still shows that there is some sort of form underneath, but sometimes too much of convex lines may make things look either symmetrical or too bulbous for the design. So most of the time, I try to keep it in the range of them being more parallel to each other. I'm still keeping it simple. I'm still treating the body as just a series of tubes and solid shapes, except it's just more unified. You'll notice that I tend to draw lines around my shapes. These are what I like to call me putting down landmarks. This is so that I know, these are just to tell me what I know what side the body part is facing, or if I know there'll be other design elements sitting on top of it. For example, I drew some lines to indicate where the belt for the character will be, or where the gauntlets for the arms start. I'll indicate where the cloth cuts off, for example, or where the eyes of the character sit, or where the cloth should sit on top of the character. Another thing you'll notice is that I'm drawing these external lines around my shape to indicate other details such as cloth piling up. For example, I would draw the leg as one unified shape. Then I would draw on top of those shapes, adding new lines to indicate where the cloth creases, where they bend, or where the overall mass of the cloth is. I would even indicate lines where the fabric folds, depending on where the limb is bending. To be able to utilize an approach like this, there are two things you need to understand. The first one being that you need to have an understanding of draftsmanship and solid form. And this is why I would recommend starting animators to start with the previous approach, option A. Eventually, you'll soon realize that you don't need to keep drawing around and through your form and over elaborate on solid forms. So you start to leave out details that won't be seen in the final form. That's why I suggest doing things slow and meticulously first, and then you'll eventually get naturally faster at it. So here's our first tie down pass, and it seems pretty solid, right? But it's still not on character model with the design, so I would start a new layer, another tie down pass to add details such as costume, facial expressions, and other details such as hair, cloth, and accessories. Because the previous passive tie down I did already indicates the form and the overall shape of the character, I, again, tend to treat this tie down pass as clear as possible. Again, I try to be more decisive and clear with my lines, heavily using my previous tie down pass as reference. Again, I repeat, if you want to improve on getting better at solid drawing, or if solid drawing is your weakness, take the time to take things slow. Do another pass of tie down if you need to. So here's my second tie down pass with cleaner lines. Now, the next option I'd like to talk about is called the hybrid. Once you gain a better hand at solidifying your drawings through tie down, you'll begin to notice that you don't need to take as many steps as the earlier examples. The first two examples I showed are more about improving your solid drawing foundation and an introduction to solidifying your drawings. The next option I'll be talking about is based on how I usually tie down my rough animation. I like to call this hybrid due to sometimes drawing solid primitives and utilizing shapes. Also, I tend to call this one a sketchy tie down since I'm not overly precious on my lines and I know that my next pass will most likely be a cleanup. The only difference besides combining the methods of option A and option B for this pass is that I try to define as much as I can in this tie down pass. This brings in factors such as costume, the face, accessories. Honestly, this is a pass I usually do when I fully understand my character, the design, and the form, and I also know how to be more economic when animating their designs. As usual, I start with my big extremes and key drawings, working my way to the breakdowns and then eventually the in-betweens. One thing I forgot to mention during my previous examples is that my initial rough hands tend to change size and proportion throughout the animation, so there are several things I have to do. One is to heavily utilize the place and trace technique, which is a technique I showed in another video on keeping your 2D animation consistent and solid. The other thing is that my shorthand pass, or my first passes, some limbs may be too stumpy or short, or the proportions just don't match up with the design I want to solidify. So I have to change the foot placement of my character when drawing it on model. If the legs are proportionally too tall or too long, I'll have to make them bend in order to fit with the overall pose, or change the pose overall. One thing I'd suggest is also to pay close attention to the foot placement of your character's feet, and make sure that if a character is standing, make sure the feet stay planted in location. Keep them grounded. I noticed when I was tying down my animation, the feet of my characters tend to slide throughout the animation, so I actually have to go back and fix these adjustments. One way to prevent this as much as possible is to draw all your major keys where all the feet are in contact with the ground first. This is something that I just remembered and I realized that I didn't have it on script, but when I did this exercise, I didn't have a character design in mind when I did the shorthand pass. So if you're animating, I suggest you already have a character design before you even start animating the character at all. This is so that it's easier to define a specific shorthand for that character and that you understand the proportions. So when you tie it down for animation, the shorthand is actually purposed to work with that design. So the reason why I'm doing this extra legwork of doing multiple passes or making readjustments is because my shorthand doesn't really entirely match with the design that I prepared for this exercise. This is not to say that you can't work like this, but when it comes to the shorthand pass, I tend to feel it out depending on the design and art style of the animation project. Anyways, I do want to go back to this type of shorthand and share my thoughts on it. This type of shorthand is, again, what I normally use for my tie down when I implement shapes while adding character detail on top of them. I start defining overall shapes and other character details such as cloth, facial expression, and other notable patterns or accessories. You'll notice that the way I approach the shorthand is quite loose. Either shapes are entirely sketchy or incomplete. You'll also notice that some of the breakdowns and in-betweens, I leave things out. Or to be more specific, I tend to leave out mundane things. Things that don't have a lot of movement or any significant movement, and things that don't show a lot of change throughout the animation. In animation, this is what is called a partial. It's when I leave out a drawing because I know when I clean it up for the final pass, I will just treat it as a normal in-between from the last drawing that indicates it to the next drawing that has the drawing of that part. For example, if I'm animating a character where the head and arms are doing all the movement while the body is usually staying static, there's not a lot of movement, it's subtle, and it's really just floating towards the next pose with the torso, then I'll only draw and animate the head and arms because those show significant movement, whereas the body just seems to drift around. And having to over elaborate on that really subtle movement for tie down, I think my time can be used better elsewhere. So if you're in-betweening and if you're dealing with movement that does not have any major significant change in the animation, I'd leave it as a partial or just do a contour of the silhouette to indicate that this is just a normal in-between. And everything else in it is going to be treated as an in-between for cleanup. It's why my breakdowns and my in-betweens contain the less detail, whereas my major keys and extremes contain the most mileage and are explored even more. The in-between to the breakdowns are really just connective tissue. So this is probably the third time I'll say it. This is a method that I usually use for my own projects. And for this pass, I'm not going to do another tie-down pass since I've put in all the information I need in this pass for a cleanup. Even though it is loose and sketchy, it's solid and descriptive enough for the cleanup stage. Since I've already shown myself doing a second tie-down pass in the previous examples, I won't need to re-elaborate on that for this one. So anyway, here's what my tie-down looks like for this approach, and can be used as reference for the ink and paint stage. So let's talk about option D, as clear as possible. So the next option I'll talk about is all about having clear lines. It's for animators that tend to move directly to the cleanest lines as possible for their tie-down. This means less pencil mileage and sketchiness, as well as less draw-throughs and around solid form. Basically, you are trying to clean up lines right after a super rough drawing. Animators such as Matt Wilmies and James Baxter usually fall into this category, where their lines are super crisp. And other animators that tend to tie down like this, it's natural for them to convey such clean lines. Now, for what I have to say about this option and method, I have quite a few things to talk about. On my first impressions, this approach is something I'd only recommend to anyone who's really good at drawing and does not need to do more than one pass to get a clean drawing. They have full confidence in their lines, they understand their draftsmanship, and are already going for a cleaner look. Either that you have a really good understanding of drawing, or you fully understand the style and the design sensibility of your characters. Maybe this comes from a place where you've drawn this character so many times in slower, meticulous ways in the past that drawing a cleaner version is just natural to you. So for me, realistic human anatomy is something that I'm not especially good at. So I have to take my time to take it slow, break everything down into solid shapes, and draw through them. Whereas people who have worked in that style for such a long time and many times, it just clicks to them right away. Another scenario where I'll consider using an approach like this is that your first pass of rough animation, or your shorthand, is solid enough and has enough information for a cleaner tie-down pass. So for example, if your shorthand pass contains mass and construction, the only few times I can recall using this approach is when I'm in a really fast deadline where I have to work at a really tight quota. I resort to this since there isn't a lot of time to figure out and solve the design and the animation. So let's say I'm making a very casual animation or a 48-hour film. I don't tend to overwork the character because I don't think it's important for the overall project. So I tend to treat my tie down as my final ink and paint. And I use it in situations where I'm not overly precious about how the drawing looks. Sometimes when I'm dealing with more simpler styles of animation, maybe more graphic, has less mileage, has less form, I would resort to this, but it's usually based on how fast I have to get things done, or how confident I feel for the project. As for things such as overlapping and follow-through action, I will draw what I think the motion is and then readjust them once I have more information on the animation as usual. So I do have some reasons why I personally don't do this approach normally. Doing this style myself for this exercise, I got mixed results and opinions. This approach is already incredibly hard for me, and as you can see, I have to go back, readjust, redo lines, erase, redraw, erase, redraw. The first reason I could immediately think of is that I don't have the strong draftsmanship or skill for it, and of course solid drawing is also, it comes from a place where I don't fully understand the character design by heart, since I've only utilized this character design for these demonstrations. It's all about line confidence, knowing when to put your lines, how to put your lines, and understanding graphic design with lines. But to me, doing tie-down this way doesn't really feel natural to me. And I tend to gear towards more sculpty aspects of tie-down, such as option A, B, and C. I like to draw through shapes, I like to feel things out, I like to be loose and expressive. I feel like I'm more in my zone when I do it this way. But maybe that's because I didn't really have to be in a situation where I had to animate detailed characters using this methodology. Is this an option I would recommend for beginners? My first answer would be absolutely not, because if you want to get better at solid drawing and improving your fundamentals and being able to do it faster in the future and being more confident, you have to take things slow. It's like practicing a dance or a move. You have to drill it slowly 100 times so your brain starts to connect and recognize patterns and slowly improve hand to eye to brain coordination. While a lot of younger or inexperienced artists think that doing fast is the only way to improve, and it does have its benefits such as getting loose, gestural, and overall getting an overall idea down and pushing it as much as you can, take time to do things slow and really think about what you're doing. I was showing some of my older animation work to my students the other week, and I told them that for my short film Tiny Nomad, I would do hundreds of thumbnails just to explore a single keyframe or key drawing or a single pose of a character. I would have several drawings exploring the same idea, but some drawings have the head tilted or the shoulder language is different because I wanted to explore what type of acting is suitable for this type of animation. I wanted to push my skills in more specific acting rather than just generic cookie cutter acting. And for me, the only way to do that is to really force myself to explore these other aspects. When one of my students asked how many thumbnails I do for a single pose, I showed them a file with hundreds of rough drawings just to explore a scene. Nowadays, I don't thumbnail as much because I know exactly what I want to draw when I draw a key pose. And that's because I forced myself to think more about my drawings. It became more natural to me. However, I'll still thumbnail it if I really want to plan and be more specific with a shot. But most of the time, especially for B shots or filler shots, I have enough skill and experience to put down exactly what I'm thinking about, what I'm picturing in my mind, instead of just exploring it a lot like I used to. Is this an option I'd recommend to more adept animators? Maybe. Like I said, this type of tie down isn't natural to me. But overall, it was a good brain buster for me because it did force me to think where and how I put down my lines, and it's not something I usually do. It's not something that I would usually do for my own projects since I feel more efficient and faster and more productive when I do something like the hybrid option or option C. However, some productions might not have that benefit, with time being the biggest factor. So when I talked to Sam Dietz, the director for the Castlevania animated series on Netflix, about the animation process and knowing the type of work that goes into it, I know that I would not be the right fit for that show because you need an amazing sense of draftsmanship, clear lines for cleanup for ink and paint, and a strong sense of Sakuga fight style animation, which I'm still trying to get my mind around. So that's option D. I found it hard, I found it frustrating, but others may find it natural to them. Again, I would tell a beginning animator to explore the other options so that they understand form and how to utilize that form with the principles and mechanics of your animation. Now let's talk about option E, the lasso tool and transformation, aka I call this the Cowboy. Now the next option I'll talk about is kind of more modern for the tie-down stage of animation, and is an approach that I used to do for my rough animation work back in my high school days. You see, I used to go to a lot of animation forums back then during my high school years, and there was one that I really liked, and there were a lot of people my age doing amazing animation in Flash. And of course, it was definitely a forum of its time. A lot of these kids were animating Naruto-esque fight sequences while the characters were lip singing or singing Panic at the Disco songs, playing on top of the fight animation. This is the mid-2000s, just to give you guys some context. And one trait that most of these guys usually had is they always used the lasso tool for their animation, or rough animation. So what is it? It's when you manipulate body parts of a character by lasso tool and using transformation tools such as distortion, rotation, skewing, frame by frame, instead of redrawing or creating new drawings for the in-betweens like in traditional animation. So for example, let's say a character is slashing a sword, and the torso doesn't really change as much. So for this example, the torso won't be redrawn, it'll be rotated, distorted throughout the animation. But the arm swinging the sword will be approached like normal hand-drawn animation since it contains the most significant movements, since I need to be more clear with the arm. The thing with distorting drawings over and over again is that it gets messy and it gets modified. If a drawing gets too messy and broken due to constant distortion, I basically have to erase and redraw some of those lines so the consistency and the clarity manages to stay intact. A lot of story artists who tend to over-animate their storyboards approach animating their characters this way. It's good enough just to show the motion of what that character is doing for the sequence. While I do have my own opinions about story artists that tend to over-animate their storyboards, storyboarding is hard, and if you have to animate your storyboards, then this is probably the best option, since storyboarding is not really about how good the drawing looks, but getting the idea across. But in my honest opinion, I don't think storyboards should be fully animated. Posed out, yeah, but when you're dealing with storyboards that have 1s, 2s, and 3s, that's a bit overkill. So the thing about this method, if you think about it, it is another evolution for the shift and trace technique. Instead of just grabbing drawings previous or after to finish a current drawing, and then tracing on top of it, why not just reuse it? especially if we're dealing with a scene where throughout the whole animation the character's detailed head is in the same angle throughout, so it would just be easier just to reuse the head. One can argue that this is just a modern solution to the shift and trace option, subtracting the mundane tracing bit. So it does seem like a cool, time-saving, and easier solution, right? Well, the way I think about this approach is like watercolor. It's easy and fun to get into, but it's terribly hard to master and easy to mess up. By lasso tooling and constantly deforming a drawing just to make it move can get messy. Like I said, the more you distort a drawing that's already been distorted before, the less clear it gets. Sometimes a character's body part will just look like a jumble of lines and dots by the frame alone. In movement, it might look great, it might just work, but for cleanup, it'll just be hell. It just creates more problems to solve, and you might end up having to redraw and redo those poses. The great thing about 2D animation is usually how good the key poses and the drawings are, and a lot of inexperienced animators who only rely on the lasso tool will probably do decently at animation on the motion side, but completely dismiss the drawing element, which basically kills it. So in a way, it can create bad habits and will lead to more problems down the line for further tie down or cleanup if you're in a production. That's why I encourage you make new drawings for your major keys, extremes, and breakdowns first. So instead of just reusing one single drawing and just constantly distorting it, you're distorting a key so it can transition into the next key. Another thing that I want to point out is depending on your skill level in animation and drawing, it can basically kill the animation. You can make the animation feel unnatural and stilted. And you have to be careful in how to distort and move body parts. In fact, it's bringing up things I'd like to talk about right now. When I was at school, there was this very entitled belief about 2D animators where if you were really good at 2D, you'd be instantly good at CG animation. While yes, a lot of the principles from 2D animation put into CG animation will make the animation better and great, CG animation introduces a lot of different approaches and rules to the medium. Take Glenn Keane for example. When he talks about animation, it's all about the feeling and the line and knowing who your character is. A lot of the fun things in animation, whereas a CG animator would think about more of the articulation of the rotation, the mechanics of the joints, etc., etc. The more technical aspects of animation. So not everyone can easily transition from 2D into 3D, because it does require another level of thinking. A great 2D animator can easily fix drawings by just redrawing it and it would work well in that 2D plane. In the CG world, you have to think about how things work systematically. If the upper shoulder moves, it's going to affect everything on the lower arm. And making small corrections on the shoulder will make big drastic impact on the arm movements. You have to really think about how each body part moves and works and how they relate to each other. If you animate in step mode, it might look fine, but when you just convert a step mode animation into spleen mode in the curve editor, you'll notice that arms will just rotate in places where they should not be rotating. And it's the same sort of mindset I have when utilizing the lasso tool approach. So when I was doing this approach, I had to think more systematically. So in this case, when I make an in-between, I would just duplicate a previous or the next drawing depending on how I feel, and distort the drawing as a whole and see how I can make it fit in between the two keys, or how I can make it fit with the rough animation underneath. Then I'll work my way distorting the upper chest and distorting the pelvis. Then I'll work my way towards the arms, legs, hands, feet, distorting them one after the other. And this is where I have to be extra careful with the spacing, because by dismissing some of the movements of some of the limbs, those limbs or body parts will end up being twitchy in the actual animation, and you'll kind of see that in the final version of this approach that I'm doing. So again, if you want to utilize this approach and be really good at it, I think you still have to have a strong understanding of draftsmanship, animation mechanics, and other principles regarding to animation. If you want an object to turn within dimension but not having to redraw it, you have to understand how perspective and form works so you know exactly which parts to distort and how, so that you can emulate that object rotating without having to draw a completely new drawing. So yeah, if you know how to use it and if there's an advantage for time saving, utilize it. The benefit I gained from this is that it allowed me to think differently in the way how I approached animation, how I solved problems, by giving myself some limitations. It definitely has its places. And there are animators that I highly look up to that utilize this method so naturally that it becomes seamless and makes the method actually cool to use. So those were the main tie downs and solid drawing methods that I kind of just wanted to talk about for this video. There were other approaches that I know of, but I feel like I'm just going to repeat myself throughout. And maybe I'll do that in another time. But to me, these 5 methods were the most significant. So for beginners, I would start with something like option A. Take it slow, take it meticulously, and do it step by step. Do multiple passes just for a tie down. You can also start with B, doing multiple passes for the tie down, but usually I would just say start at option A so you understand form. And once you do that, it's easier for you to just draw out solid shapes without having to overdraw as much. Option C is how I usually approach tie down in solid drawing. It feels most natural to me. It combines things that I learned from option A and option B, except I try and fill out as much as I can for the tie down, since that tie down will just be used for cleanup. But again, if I have problems trying to figure out the character form or the shape, I would resort back to option A and B. Option D is something that I'm not the most comfortable with. I only use it for more casual projects when I'm really tight on time, and it's not something you'll see me do for personal projects. But depending on how detailed and advanced the drawings of the characters are, then this approach is ridiculously hard, and I feel like I'm more efficient with something where I do get to draw through my form. I don't recommend this one for beginning animators. Some productions may force you to use it though. I've never been put in that situation myself. Option E is a hit or miss for me. It's not something that I would recommend for beginners, but it is fun to do. And it really flexes another part of your brain for animation. But I feel like to take advantage of this approach, you really have to have a good understanding of solid form, drawing, animation, etc. That can be gained through experience over time, or doing slow approaches like option A and option B for tie down. Another thing that I want to repeat is that this one forces you to think more systematically and kind of tests you to see how you can use your drawing knowledge and animation knowledge into something that doesn't really make you draw as much. How would you emulate those principles? Through distortion. If you were to use this pass for tie down, I would just go back and clean it up a bit more in case the lines get too messy, but otherwise, it's what it is. Anyways, thanks so much for watching this video. That's really all I have to say, and I hope you sort of gained some knowledge from this. Okay, bye. Interested in learning hand-drawn animation or learning how to finish an animated shot from beginning to end? Have a look at the store where you'll find the complete Introduction to 2D Animation video course, tutorials, and other resources. Learn classical animation approaches, drawing, lectures, techniques, and other process videos. Visit the store through the link in the description below.